Welcome one and all to the second final day of the 2-day workshop on mediation. We hope that you enjoyed the insightful session by Ms. Kathleen Rowan Leedy yesterday. First, a little bit about MediateGuru. MediateGuru is a social initiative led by members across the globe. The aim of the organization is to bridge the gap between general public and litigation. We are creating a social awareness campaign for showcasing mediation as the future. Having successfully conducted various international webinars promoting alternative dispute resolution, having a reach in more than 60 countries around the world, with an international family growing each day, we thrive to provide you the best lecture series through the best speakers around the globe so that you have a value addition today. I feel honored today to welcome our esteemed speaker for the session, Ms. Maureen Robertshaw. Ms. Maureen is a Harvard Law School trained negotiator, family law mediator, custody evaluator, parenting time expeditor, and a parenting consultant. She earned a certificate in dispute resolution from Cornell University, completed Harvard Law School's program on negotiation, and is a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Sloan School of Management. Ms. Maureen trains attorneys and therapists on intimate partner violence dynamics and has guest lectured at several law schools on the subject. She has worked with high conflict families for many years through the Wellstone Family Safety Program and has trained in child growth and development. She holds a seat on the Minnesota State Bars Association Alternative Dispute Resolutions Council. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Without any further ado, let us begin. Maureen, ma'am, I would request you to take the session forward and enlighten us all. If you have any questions throughout the session, please use the chat box below.
Hello, everyone. I feel so honored to be here with all of you, and I am so grateful that there are so many people interested in mediation, how it can help families, and in learning more about domestic abuse and intimate partner violence. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about the journey that led me here. I started out as a crisis advocate for domestic violence victims. I worked with them for many years. Domestic violence advocates show up when there's a crisis, so the police would get a hold of me or the hospital, and I would support the victim then. After the crisis had concluded, I would turn them over to a long-term advocate. Over time, I started to feel like, metaphorically speaking, I was putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. I wanted to spend more time with victims, survivors, and their families and children. I had originally started out studying physics and political science, but after having my own children, I became really interested in healthy family dynamics. I moved into supervised visitation, which in the United States is court-ordered time for a parent to be with their child when it's not safe for them to be alone, either due to alleged child abuse or alleged domestic violence. After being there for many years and reading so many court orders and watching families go through years-long court litigation where it drained the family financially and emotionally, I would see that those families did not have a positive long-term outlook. I wanted to be able to change that and help, which is why I went to Cornell University, then Harvard, then MIT, and then I trained in family law mediation, custody evaluation, and parenting consulting or coordinating. In the United States, the custody evaluation is where you become the foremost expert for the court on that family. You do an investigation, which usually takes between 3 and 6 months. You write up your findings and recommendations, and you give them to the judge. In parenting coordination or parenting consultant, you are appointed by the court when parents can't seem to get along, to make any decisions, and are repeatedly coming back to court. When you're initially given an issue by the parents, like which school should a child go to, you try to start with mediation and see if they can come to a wise decision together. If that becomes impossible, then the PC makes the determination. This determination has the same binding effect as a district court judge, with the only difference being the parents can directly appeal your decision to the district court judge instead of being sent along to an appeals court. I love the work that I do, and I am so happy that you're all here. I'd like to start out with just a couple quick things before we jump into the presentation. One is I am speaking from an American legal perspective and social perspective. That might not be the same in your country, and different terminology may be used. I would also like to say that I am on LinkedIn, and if I don't get to your question today, please connect with me there. If you send a message, please put in that you were there today at the webinar, and I'll try to make sure to get back to you. I'd like to talk a little bit about the problem. We have a worldwide crisis with domestic abuse and violence. 40 to 70% of female murder victims, depending who you believe, or which source you're contacting, are murdered by their current partner or an ex-partner. In the United States, the #1 cause of death for pregnant women is homicide by a current or former partner. This affects everyone, and it's a public health problem. There's a wonderful study, which you can Google, called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. It's a very simple text of only 10 questions about what happens to children before they're 18. What the study has found is that if you have a high score on there, like an 8 or 9, those children end up dying up to 20 years sooner than their peers from diabetes, heart disease. The pain that we take in can become physical. That does not mean that any child that has that score will. The district attorney in San Diego had a score, I think, of an 8 or 9, and he has had a happy, healthy, and successful life. But it takes a lot of work, and it takes a community to be there for them. And the other thing you should know is that in the first year after separation, that is when a woman is most likely to be killed, and her children, by the ex-partner. I would like to say that I am going to be speaking, again, from an American perspective, and just for clarity's sake, I will be using male pronouns for the person, the abusive party, and female pronouns for the victim or survivor. It is not that women cannot be abusive, they can and are, and that men cannot be victims. It's just statistically speaking, 85% of cases are male to female. And I'm ready to start. So just to give you a little bit of a roadmap of where we'll be going, first we'll be discussing types of violence. This is critical for you to identify what type of violence or abuse is present in order to safely mediate or make the decision that it is not safe. Then we'll talk about how violence impacts the cognition of survivors, what you can expect to see, what things that may be present that you might have to plan for. And then we'll finish up with your role as a mediator or as an attorney bringing a client to mediation. And please, if you have questions at any point, please send them in. I am leaving a lot of time at the end to answer specific questions. So there are 3 types of violence or abuse that we talk about in intimate partner violence or domestic abuse. I will use those words interchangeably, and again, it might be expressed in a different way, which within the country you're at. So there's situational violence or abuse, reactive violence or abuse, and coercive manipulation and control. Situational violence. Instances of situational violence do not necessarily form a pattern. This type of violence is specific to the situation, and it does not typically escalate over time. There is not an ongoing effort to exert power and control over the other between fights, and the violence may be mutual and may occur much less often than domestic violence does. One thing I would keep in mind with situational violence is that usually when this is present, both parties will tell you about it, the same story, and usually they are horrified and embarrassed by their behavior and do not want it to happen again. One example, I've had clients who both have drug problems, and when they were very high, they would get into a fight. This would be situational violence, and the safety planning for that is much easier. Reactive and resistant violence. Reactive or resistance violence is used by victims to resist domination and battering, retaliate against abuse, and establish some parity in the relationship. This is when someone is being attacked and they fight back, or that they preemptively fight back. We did have a client who was beaten repeatedly, and her significant other, her husband, called her from work and said he'd be home soon, and he was angry. So she knew what was going to happen to her. Instead of leaving the home or calling police, she decided to take things into her own hands. And when he got home, she hit him with a baseball bat. She was sent to jail for this assault. So this type of violence used by a victim can result in arrest and criminal charges for the victim. In the United States, in several jurisdictions, if the police come to a domestic violence incident, and both parties have marks on them, sometimes they'll immediately arrest both parties, even though one was using self-defense. Then we come to coercive manipulation and control. The distinguishing feature of intimate partner violence is that it forms a pattern of abuse. The way in which the abuse manifests can vary, but one constant component of domestic violence in one's partner's consistent effort to maintain power and control over the other. Each act of violence is a systemic pattern of power and control perpetuated by one intimate partner to the other. This is not anger management problems. This is plotted. This is considered well in advance. I've worked with many men who have said, you only have to hit them once and you can keep the threat of that forever. Some other men I've worked with who are very manipulative and controlling say you're not abusing them right or keeping them in line if you have to use physical violence. So please keep in mind that coercive manipulation and control may not include physical violence. It may be emotional violence and abuse, and a lot of times there's sexual violence. This is one that is extremely concerning, and that most of the homicides of women by partners and ex-partners were in these situations of coercive manipulation and control. So those are the three that you're going to want to try to figure out with whatever situation you have in front of you, which type of violence it is. This is something that is extremely useful. It is called the Power and Control Wheel. It's made by Domestic Abuse Intervention Program out of Duluth, Minnesota. It is kind of the gold standard. It was then adopted by the United Nations. So I'd like to walk you through this Power and Control Wheel. And please, this is available for free online. Google it, read it. It can be very helpful when you're meeting with a client who may not be sure that there was abuse in the relationship, especially if there wasn't physical violence. And this can really help them see what's going on. So outside of the circle, we have physical and sexual violence. This is what makes it possible for all the other spokes of abuse in the circle. So we start with using intimidation. That's making her afraid by using looks, actions, gestures, destroying her property, abusing pets, displaying weapons. We have had a lot of problems with people threatening pets. And then when women flee, we often have to find a place for their pet because they're convinced that the other person will kill that pet. Using emotional abuse. Perpetrators try to make the other party's self-esteem as small as possible so that she is less likely to get help and to leave. Tactics include putting her down, making her feel bad about herself, calling her names, making her think she's crazy. There's a common term used called gaslighting, and that's where you intentionally try to make the other person doubt their sense of reality. After working with thousands of victims, I can tell you that these emotional wounds take so much longer to heal from. I've heard before the bruises fade, but 10 years later, they can still hear this person's voice in their head telling them that they're not worthy, that they're fail, that they're bad. They use isolation. This is particularly used in rural areas, although it can be used in urban as well. That's where one partner controls what the other does, who they see, who she talks to, whether she has friends, where she goes. They try to make sure that she doesn't have a support system, that she only has that person. Oftentimes you can tell what's going on because they're minimizing, denying, and blaming. And this is when the abuse is brought up that either it's minimized, oh, it wasn't that bad, denying that ever happened, which is more a form of gaslighting, and blaming the victim. If I hadn't done this, then I wouldn't have lost my temper. Another way to control is using children. Make her feel guilty about the children. Try to use the children to relay messages. Put her down to the children so that they don't think much of her either. Or always threatening to take the children away. This is particularly effective against mothers. They may use male privilege, saying because they are the male in the family, that they are in charge, it is their castle, and she is essentially a slave to their whims. Economic abuse, we see this over and over again, where one partner has no access to the family resources or finances, where a woman is not allowed to get a job, or they keep harassing you at your job enough that you lose it. And this is another reason for isolating the victim, trying to take away any support people that might see something at work, that might try to support her. And the last is using coercion and threats. You do not have to physically harm another person to get that message across that you will. I've had several clients who he would punch the wall right beside their head, and they certainly got the message. A lot of times threats are used about leaving. If you leave, I'll kill you, I will kill your family, I will kill the family dog, I'll take the children and kill them. So these are all very concerning, and this is for coercive manipulation and control. Please Google this, keep one on hand. It's a lot easier to look at the symptoms this way. So the type of violence matters. Situational violence is a form of abuse. However, unlike domestic or reactive resistant violence, it's less likely to result in long-term physical or psychological illness or in homicide. When you're going to be providing these services of mediation, or when you're going to be taking a client to mediation, figure out what type of violence this is. As a mediator, you need to know in order to safety plan and to figure out if this is even appropriate. In America, in the 1990s, essentially, if there was domestic abuse, absolutely no mediation was appropriate. We've come a long way since then, and we've had many survivors say, no, I want to do this for myself. I want to make some choices. And so it can be done, but we need to do it safely. So I'd like to do an exercise with you. I'm going to give you 3 scenarios, and after I read them, I'd like you to take just a minute. If you have a pen and paper ready, that's great. And ask yourself after hearing the scenario, what type of violence is this an example of? What impact might this have on my alternative dispute resolution plan or process? And are there any factors from a power and control wheel present? Scenario 1. Jake and Madison are at a party. They both have drank a lot and are drunk. At the end of the party, they fight about who should drive home. Madison pushes Jake and tells him he is a loser. Jake pushes Madison back and tells her she's a sloppy drunk. They push and shove each other some more until one of their friends breaks it up. The next day, both Jake and Madison are embarrassed and horrified by their behavior. So if you take just 1 minute to think those through. So this is an example in scenario 1 of situational violence and abuse. Both Jake and Madison were embarrassed. If they're in your office, they're probably telling you relatively the same story of what happened, and neither one ever wants this to happen again. It is not on either of their parts an opportunity or trying to control the other. It was some very bad decision making. So if this is what you're confronted with, you probably don't need a lot of safety planning. Scenario 2. Tyler picks up his wife Ella's phone while she is in the bathroom. He sees she's been texting with a male coworker. Tyler tells Ella she is a whore and he is done with her humiliating him. Ella says he's just a coworker and a friend, nothing more. Tyler slaps Ella. Ella cries and Tyler gets angrier. Ella tries to get away to the kitchen. Tyler grabs her and punches her in the face. Ella gets up and starts hitting Tyler on the head with a heavy glass candle. And I'll give you another minute to think through that and answer those questions to yourself. So there are a couple of things to look out for in this example. The first is Tyler is going through her phone when she's not there. That can seem like a controlling behavior. He puts her down. He slaps her. But this is really important, is when she starts to cry, Tyler gets angrier. That is a red flag. In healthy relationships, when one partner is distressed and crying, the other partner usually wants to comfort them. But this is only making him angrier. He gets up and punches her in the face. She gets up and starts hitting Tyler on the head with a heavy glass candle. So this can be resistant reactive violence mixed in with some coercive control. A lot of times, these aren't really simply cut and dried, except for situational violence. If we went with that scenario, you'd need some serious safety planning. And here's scenario 3. Connor and Gail have 4 children between the ages of 10 and 15. Both Connor and Gail work, but Connor handles the finances. Each week they take turns buying groceries. On Connor's week, he spends $200 on groceries and buys all the foods the children like. On Gail's week, he gives her $50 to spend on groceries. Gail can't buy enough food. When the children complain, Connor tells them their mom isn't good with money and she doesn't care what they like to eat. Connor says Gail isn't a very good mother. So please think this one through for a minute. So this one doesn't involve any violence in the example, but it does have domestic abuse characteristics and coercive control. Connor isn't completely in charge of the finances. She has no control over them, and he is denigrating her to the children on purpose for control. So this is coercive controlling behavior, and you need to watch out for this. This too would take some serious safety planning. So a few thoughts on power. Power is not something most of us like to talk about. It's uncomfortable. If you can, please think about a relationship that you have. Who has more power in that relationship? Why does that individual have more power? It really is something uncomfortable that most of us don't talk through with our partners. I would suggest doing that and see how both of your perceptions on the same thing, whether you see it the same way. And if you don't, that's really a good time to talk. How do we distinguish when power is really based more on perception than actual power? So early on in my career, I had a very angry father in my office. It was a large room at that time. And I just explained what the court order meant for his visitation. He walked about 12 feet away from me and was pacing, very angry. At one point, he turned around, and just for the sake of the picture, you should know that he's a very big man, closer to about 400 pounds, and had a pretty serious meth addiction, methamphetamine. He was angry, and he started to charge right at me. I didn't move, not of any type of bravery or courage, nothing like that. I didn't move for two reasons. The first was, I wanted whatever happened at that point to be completely his choice. The other part was, I was really curious what was going to happen next. So he did end up stopping right before my face. And he said he needed to go, cool down for a while, we could have another appointment. I said, that's a great idea. So a few days later, I had a new client that was in the room, and I was in a hallway. And the first man I hear telling the new guy, oh, you know, Maureen, she seems nice, and she wears those cute dresses, but she's terrifying. As there's clearly some type of perception about the power I was holding at that moment, which was probably not accurate. But it didn't matter because that was his perception. As attorneys, as teachers, as mediators, as judges, we really need to think about the power that we hold, whether we feel that that's accurate or not, but it's the power that other people are perceiving we do have, and that affects their behavior and their cognition. So as much as possible, please, besides trying to work on the power imbalances between parties, please try to work on that power imbalance between you and the client. You'll get a lot farther that way, and mediation will be a much better option for people when your power is interfering with their choices. So, when I teach at colleges, I have noticed that students seem to remember a lot more when I teach them about failure. I'm not sure if it's because we're hardwired for loss aversion and risk aversion in our neurocortex, but for some reason, teaching failure is memorable. So I'm going to teach you a few horrible ways to manage perceived power imbalances. The first is manipulation tactics. This is passive aggressiveness as an example. I had a client who said to the other party, I thought when I told you that you didn't have to come to the event, you would know I wanted you to come. So this is manipulative. She isn't saying what she means and meaning what she says. That's not a good way to deal with power imbalances. Please don't do that. Gamesmanship. So there's a family that I know, and they have 3 daughters, and the youngest is 5, and the older girls are about 3 and 6 years older, and they're much bigger than little 5-year-olds. So they pick on their little sister, and she doesn't like it, but she has no way really to make that power imbalance less. So this is her solution. Her mother drinks Diet Coke soda, and the children are not allowed to have those. So on laundry day, the 5-year-old would go and take one of her mom's cans of Diet Coke, force them out in the sink, and then put it by her sister's laundry bin so her mother would find it. This did not help the situation of this young girl with her sisters. Her sisters would say that they were framed. Of course, the mother didn't believe that because 5-year-olds don't frame people, although this one did. That is a terrible way. Please don't play games. Again, say what you mean what you say, and really hear the other person. Another time, a personal failure of mine, I was with a client who was very angry, and he called me the moral equivalent of a Nazi office worker. I did not handle that well. I burst out laughing because it was so absurd. This did not endear me to him, and it did not help any type of relationship building. So please don't laugh, no matter how absurd. So now that we know how to fail, let's see some ways that we might be able to succeed. So I have some possibly successful suggestions for managing power imbalances. So when I first started working with high conflict families, a lot of the time the men would be sent to me by court order. For the first week, I watched my first interviews, and they went badly. What would typically happen is he would show up, the receptionist would send him down to me, and as soon as he walked into my door, he would start into a speech about how unfair this was, about how women just want to tell men what to do, and how this was unacceptable. So after watching this over and over again and seeing that it wasn't working, I tried to redesign my entire process. So I looked at my environment, I evaluated what was happening, and I looked for what I could change. So social science and behavioral research tells us that environment directly impacts thought process and behavior. So this is what I changed mine to. In my office, I changed it so I did not have any statistics about domestic violence or abuse. Instead, I had an art collection. I had a bookcase with lots of books, because that's another connection point when I see, oh, I loved that book. Me too. I had pictures of my family, my 3 sons and my husband, as a humanizing thing to show, like, I'm just a regular person like you. You have a family, I have a family. We probably understand some of the dynamics. I changed how people got to my office. When I would have a receptionist call me, I would walk right up to them in the reception area. I would shake their hand. I'd tell them I was happy to meet them. And I meant it. So if you're going to do that, being sincere is incredibly important, because that will undermine any type of trust if they think that you're not being sincere. I have a soft appearance. I wear dresses. I also make sure that when they're in my office, so I never wear power suits. When they come into my office, I had rearranged it so there was no longer a desk between me and them. I could move my chair, so it was just me to them. I also made sure I had a really comfortable client chair. It was a nice, easy chair so that they could really be comfortable. I also didn't spend much time in that first meeting on what brought them to my office. I spent a lot of the time learning about them and asking open-ended questions. Be curious. Again, sincerity is key here. Be clear on your process with people. Trust is built by fulfilling the expectations you set up. So be very clear and make darn sure that you follow through. Another thing that can be helpful is labeling the obvious. Hostage negotiators do this because it makes people feel understood. It can feel kind of silly at first when you're listening to someone who may be saying how frustrated they are by the system. Mirroring that back, like, I can hear you really frustrated, makes them know that you heard them and you care what they said. So I'd like to talk now about how violence and abuse can affect cognition. Violence and the brain. Survivors of abuse can be prone to extreme flight or fight responses. The amygdala of traumatized individuals are often overly sensitive, resulting in extreme alertness. These individuals may appear aggressive, they might be overly sensitive to perceived threats, or they may completely withdraw and shut down. Please, when you're meeting with a client, keep these things in mind. We have a fight or flight response, which works great for an immediate threat, but when that is triggered over and over and over again, it causes real damage. So the effects of intimate partner violence on children. We already talked about the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Emotional Experiences Study. But here's some things that you can look out for in case you're doing child-centered mediation or child-informed. The emotional responses. Children who witness domestic violence may include fear, guilt, shame, sleep disturbances, sadness, depression, and an anger. And surprisingly, that anger can be against the abuser and against the person being abused, because they're upset that that person didn't stop what was happening. Physical responses. stomach aches, headaches, bedwetting. Bedwetting is a huge red flag that something very abusive is happening. It can be sexual abuse, physical abuse, or watching someone else's abuse. But if you have a child that has already been potty trained, suddenly bedwetting, pay attention to that. That really matters. So I'd like to talk a little bit with you about survivors of abuse. They often develop mental illnesses from the abuse. Due to the control exerted by the abuser, usually they do not have treatment for their mental illnesses. They can appear erratic, illogical. They may have developed really unhealthy coping strategies for the abuse, like using drugs or alcohol. They may have an addiction. They have serious trust issues, and they can appear apathetic or be very anxious to please authority figures. So watch out for those things. Over and over again, I will have a survivor come into my office and say, act somewhat erratically and say, he says that I'm crazy, and I know you won't believe me. So pay attention to these and expect to see some of these and plan accordingly. So a few notes on abusers or batterers. When they come for their interviews, they usually appear very calm, very together, especially for mediation. They can express themselves logically. They can be extremely manipulative, and they will try to manipulate you. Watch out for that. It's really easy to spot once you expect to see it, or know the signs to look for. They will try to co-opt the mediation a lot of the times in order to use it as another system against her to abuse her. Pay attention because you do not want to be part of that. They often minimize and justify abuse. They can be very, very likable. I enjoyed most of my clients. After working with thousands of people, there have only been 3 that I haven't found some human connection point where I enjoyed things about them, because no person is just the worst thing or just the best thing they've ever done. I do count those 3 as personal failures because there had to be something. But I really enjoyed who I worked with. And you need to keep that in mind, because they are whole people, and that no one ever has changed their behavior through being condemned by others. But building trust as a foundation can help them rethink things and can help them really hear what you're saying, even if you say it in a soft voice like mine. They are often extremely jealous. They have unrealistic expectations. They blame others for all of their problems, which is really easy to hear as they explain a situation. A lot of times they have a very rigid belief in gender roles. Please, when you're looking at someone with alleged abuse allegations against them, do not decide whether they did it because they're likable or because of their position in the community. I had one mother whose 15-year-old daughter told her that her dad was touching her inappropriately, and the mother went to Child Protection Services and made a report. The worker told her, "Oh, that's not true. He's a doctor. He wouldn't do that." Yeah, some doctors do. Some lawyers, some judges, firemen, nurses. It doesn't matter what their job is. They're just more likely to get away with it if they're a law enforcement or a judge or a doctor in this case. So each of us is unique. Each of us has unique life experiences, and we experience trauma differently, and we display that trauma differently. So although these are what you're most likely to see, please don't make them a checklist where if you don't see them, then the abuse doesn't exist. Your job really isn't to decide yes or no what the truth of the allegations. Your job is to safety plan on the basis that if they were true, how can we keep everyone safe? So I would like to talk to you about your role as the mediator or as the attorney. So we spoke earlier about the power and control wheel. This is another power and control wheel, but it's for post-separation power and control. The post-separation wheel uses 3 dimensions to reveal how an abuser's post-separation violence functions. The black base layer are systems and institutions. These represent how systems and often unwittingly collude with an abuser in his controlling tactics by providing a foundation of policies, decisions, and interactions that ignore the effects of his past and potential violence on the women he batters and on their children. I had one family that I worked with for years. 400 motions were filed in the local court. The wife filed exactly 3 of them: a child support order, custody determination, and a paternity. He used and weaponized the court system to continually drag her to hearings, to make her spend money on lawyers. She lost her job absences due to being in court. The wheel's middle layer, prior physical and sexual violence and coercive controlling behavior against the mother and children, represents how the abuser's past abuse and its effects support his post-separation tactics using the children. If you know someone has attacked someone in the past, anything they may say, everything that they say, can have that past abuse behind it. That's another way to control. The top layer, which consists of hubs, spokes, and rims, completes a simple, powerful system. The post-separation wheel shows how the batterer's unrelenting focus on the survivor, as well as the systems and institutions that he is engaged, allow him to use the children as tools in a system of tactics that enable his power and control over the hub, even when they aren't together, and even if he's under a court order not to contact her. It's worth keeping in mind that a woman and her children are most likely to be killed by their ex-partner in the first year that they've been away from them. That is a sobering reality for all of us. So what can you do? And how do we handle this if you're the mediator? It is helpful as an attorney to also screen your clients. So the first thing you'll do is have, with your regular paperwork, is have a tier 1 screening. This is just routine screening used before meeting with any client to decide if there are any intimate partner violence issues that you need to address. If the tier 1 screening shows up some concern, then you would move on to tier 2. This screening you're going to use to determine if services are appropriate and what safety protocol would be applicable here. So let's look at what tier 1 might look like. So the tier 1 screening example. These are questions that I use. These are from the state of Georgia. It's my favorite ones, but you can make up your own. Your country might have some, your local government, or really just looking online and picking and choosing what you feel is important. So I ask if there has ever been a protective order, restraining order, or stalking order. 80% of female murder victims were stalked before they were killed. Stalking is a very scary thing, and that homicides this way are the most predictive of all homicides. They're easiest to predict, and they happen over and over. We ask if child services is involved. A lot of times that's another tactic people use by calling in fraudulent complaints to Child Protective Services, so the mother has to jump through all of these hoops, and it's just another way to control and let her know that you're still there and you can still hurt her. I ask if either party's ever been arrested, and I want them to explain what happened. An arrest doesn't automatically really mean anything. Lots of people have been arrested, when they're 20 years old for some infraction that isn't a really big deal. They're 40 now, it probably has no impact. But you want to know exactly what those were for and when. Ask about any arrests related to drug or alcohol abuse. Ask if they're afraid of the other party. If they are, ask them to tell you why. Ask if they have any concerns how the other party acts if they don't get their way. Ask if they or another party ever threatened to commit suicide, which we see a lot, harm the other party, harm the children, which is also a threat we see almost always across the board. They can threaten to harm other family members, harm family pets, use a weapon, and ask if they're still living in the home. They may still be living in the home, financially can't move yet, and ask how they feel it would go if they disagreed with that person during mediation and then went home. A note on family pets. When I worked in supervised visitation, there was a father who was visiting with his children, and he told the children he had just gotten a new puppy. Usually when children hear a new puppy, they're excited and want to know about it. Pardon me. They want to see pictures, but instead, these children looked terrified. One ran into the bathroom and started vomiting. Only later, talking with the children, the mom, did we find out that their last dog, their father had tortured and murdered in front of them. So these are really important things to know. So if it's all no's to tier 1 screening, you don't need to go on to tier 2, but it's still important when you're in the mediation that if any red flags come up, that you find a way to screen again. Tier 2 screening. So you want to make sure that they understand the process, how mediation works, why it's been ordered in their case, because if they have safety concerns, they might not know how mediation works. They might think that it's similar to a courtroom and they will be safe. Ask them what happens when you speak your mind. What happens when you express your point of view to this person? Have they ever denied you the right to access family resources such as money, transportation, a phone. Are you afraid of disagreeing with them? What happens when you disagree with them? Do they feel able to be safe and disagree in a room? If they don't feel able to disagree safely in the room, you cannot mediate. Mediation relies on autonomy and self-direction. If those are not present, mediation is worthless. Ask if they've ever tried to isolate them. You'll see that a lot of these questions have to do with the power and control wheel. Ask if the other party ever stalked them, repeated emails, calls, social media. Ask if you've ever had a protective order. Have they ever interfered with you being able to talk to an attorney or an advocate? Have they controlled you going to school or having a job? Then you want to know if have they ever, or your party, hit, strangled, pushed, or slapped one another. Now, the answer yes to this question doesn't mean that mediation can't happen. Sometimes it means there needs to be a lot of safety planning. And we saw in the original example with Jake that it could be situational. Someone that has pushed another person is not on the same level of danger as someone who has strangled another person. Then find out how they feel how mediation will go. Do they think it's possible to come to resolution? Do they think because of all of these issues that they can't? Spend some time to find out these questions and the answers before you agree to mediate. So, once you've done your screening and there are allegations of intimate partner violence or domestic abuse, you need to do a risk assessment. There are lots of them online that you can find. You can develop your own. How risky is this type of behavior, like a shove versus strangulation? In Minnesota, strangulation is a straight-up felony, whereas a shove is not. The level of violence matters, and you need to keep yourself safe and the other party. The goal of your safety planning is to keep everyone safe. It's possible that this mediation is not appropriate, in which case you should turn it down, or it can be appropriate depending on the safety planning that you do. One quick note that I want to make is the extraordinary power of language in intimate partner violence. So just like you may have inside jokes with your family or your friends that other people don't understand, but you do, there's secret communication from an abuser to a victim. It often carries threats for the future through reminders of past violence, and others in the room rarely have any idea that a threat of injury or death has just been passed in front of them. So I was in a mediation where I was a support person, not the mediator, and it was domestic violence. Because of the level of violence, the mediator had them in separate rooms and would just walk back and forth. So she never saw him, he never saw her. The mediator, after a few back and forths, came back in and said, oh, he said he'd really like permission to, and he wants to take the kids to Canada for a trip. It sounded like a really normal request, and we're in northern Minnesota, so we hear a lot about going to Canada for trips. The victim looked pale, she was trembling, shaking, and so we all knew something had just happened. And like Kathleen advises, we kind of leaned into that feeling. Like, what are you feeling? What's going on? Can you explain to us? Really feel this and explain. And she said the last conversation they had before the protective order was filed, he had threatened to kill her and take the children to Canada where they'd never be found. Now that mediator had no idea that he had just passed a death threat, but that message was sent by the abuser to the abused, and he knew she would understand the message he was sending. So be careful about language. Now, there's no way for you to know in advance, or this mediator to know in advance, about this particular issue with the past in Canada. So you need to pay attention to how the victim looks as you give words from the other person. Are they pale? Are they trembling? Or do they just completely check out? Instead of talking about anything, you say yes, yes, whatever he wants. So, and if that happens, you really need to call a break, because that isn't self-directed and that's not about autonomy. If they've shut down where they cannot make decisions for themselves. So, safety planning possibilities. One good option, depending on the level of violence and abuse, is asymmetrical mediation. This can be where you meet with one party in the morning, one party in the afternoon, and again until it's worked out. Caucus-only sessions. These are recommended, where you have one party in one room, the other party in the other room, and you, the mediator, walk between those two. Another thing can work is staggering arrival and departure times. So in the past, I've had the abusive party arrive 10 minutes prior. So he is in my office, and then I will text the other party and say he's here so that she'll be able to get into the building and he isn't waiting for her outside. At the end of the session, I'll have her leave, and then I will wait 10 to 15 minutes before I let the other party leave so he can't follow her. Do be cognizant of language if you can, paraphrase if possible. One thing that is really helpful, especially with this type of abuse, is allowing the victim to bring a support person or a domestic abuse advocate with her. This person generally doesn't speak in the negotiation, but just having that support can really help the victim feel calmer, grounded, and able to make better decisions for themselves. But also check in often, and please schedule appropriately. If you know that there's been significant violence, do not schedule when you are alone in an office, when other people aren't nearby. If you're an attorney, these are some tips on how to prepare your client. Please have a conference with a mediator to make sure you understand their process before. What's worked well for me is I'll have a conversation with both attorneys on a conference line so everyone has the same information. Then you need to carefully explain the mediation process to your client before you arrive for mediation. Make sure they understand what's going to happen. It's a lot easier to process if they already have the expectation of how it will be carried out. You also need to manage your client's expectations. We've all been there where a client wants, X, Y, and Z, and we know that is extremely unlikely. So it's good to talk them through their expectations ahead of time, and you kind of need to manage what is likely and what isn't for them. Please ask for breaks when needed for you or your client. Breaks are great. They give our brains a little bit of a break. We can re-regulate our emotions, take a walk down the hallway, stretch. Also, you can utilize stress reduction techniques that have worked for you, and you can teach it to your client, either deep cleansing breaths, something that helps you and helps with stress. If you prepare your client this way, you'll have a much better mediation center session. So if you are more interested in other things and to continue this conversation, here are some websites that are really helpful. The Duluth model is excellent and kind of the gold standard. I developed this presentation with my esteemed colleague, Alex Glassman. He is wonderful. He's an attorney who full-time just does mediation. And again, I am on LinkedIn. Please just search for my name, send a connection request, send a question. I would be so happy to engage with you. And in case I don't get to anyone's questions today, I would be happy to consult at any time or to try to answer. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Maureen, with such insightful information. I'm sure there are loads of questions our viewers have, but we will go through a few in the question and answer round now. The first question is, do parties after mediation settlement revisit with the same fight or issue again?
I hate to give the attorney answer, but it depends. Sometimes when they've really both been honest about their issues and the interests that lay behind them, then they don't. And it's written out, everyone agrees. Sometimes someone may not be completely honest, or situations changes where at first it was appropriate for them to have this amount of custody, but now that the child is in school, it needs to be changed. So sometimes I do see people come back. Other times I may meet with someone, for 2 mediation sessions and I never see them again professionally.
Thank you. The second question is, how can we prevent vulnerable or poor people from such emotional responses of intimidation or violence?
That's a large question. I think one of the best things you can do is having a support person present, either a professional advocate or a family member, possibly their pastor or priest be with them. And I would suggest having them in separate rooms. I would make the session shorter, and I would take a lot of breaks. But really, one key thing is if you see that they're shutting down and they can't make a decision, or they're just saying yes to get out of there, you need to end the session then and say you'll come back. Because it's possible they have just been so emotionally run down by this session that they can't truly answer for themselves.
Thank you. How can we save children who have been sexually, mentally, or physically abused or harassed by their own family members?
That is such a tragedy when that happens. After working with a lot of children, that is a difficult question. Um, in the United States, depending on what licensure you have, whether you're a therapist or an attorney, we do have laws about mandated reporting, which is where if you hear of a child sexually or physically abused or emotionally abused, by law, you have to notify Child Protection Services. It's really important too that you let clients know ahead of time if that is part of your licensure, so they know that this comes up, I have to tell someone. Then you make the report and you tell them that you did. It's difficult with families to see what you can do. I would definitely try to speak with family members about it, speak with schools, try to set up as much support as you can. And it's possible that mediation won't work because one person is abusive and abusing the children, and those children are never safe with that person. It's possible that they can utilize supervised visitation, which is where they have time with their children, but the entire time they're at a safety center or they're with a trained person to help with the interaction and to cut it off if it's not okay.
Thank you. How can modern day feminism help in overcoming violence over women?
I'm sorry, I missed one of those words. Could you repeat it?
How can modern day feminism help in overcoming violence over women?
So I am a very proud feminist, but I have 3 sons, as I mentioned, and they're 14, 12, and 7. So when my oldest son was 11, he borrowed a t-shirt of mine and wore it to school. The t-shirt said, "Feminism is a radical notion that women are people." So I was kind of excited. When he came home, I asked him, like, "Oh, did your friends like the shirt?" And he said, "No." I said, "Oh, why do you think they didn't?" And he said, "Well, because they think that feminism means that women just get to tell them what to do." So I think educating what feminism actually means and how I've explained it to my children is I took 4 quarters, which are each worth 25 cents, and $1, which is, so 4 quarters each were equal a dollar in coins, and then a paper dollar bill. And I explained that even though they're different, they have the same value. So I think we need to teach people that feminism is just about human decency.
All right. The next question is, if your client is the abusive party, how would you control them or convince them to act differently?
As the mediator, you may not have a lot of traction with that. As an attorney or a support person, you probably have a lot more. When I worked in supervised visitation, I would have long-term relationships with families. And like I said, the first thing I would do is focus on building trust and really try to get to know that person sincerely, care about that person. I would definitely suggest not just telling them that they're bad and condemning them, because no one ever changes due to that. But after you build a relationship over time, they're much more open to hear you. And through that relationship, you can probably get to a better place. With some clients, it really might just be like an intervention type situation. Like, this is not okay. This is what it's doing to your family, and you need to rethink this. Or enlist family members if possible. Or elders in the community. A lot of times the faith community can be very helpful too. Their cleric can be helpful.
We have 2 more questions. Which is the most useful technique to calm down our client during the sessions with mediator according to your experience?
With my experience, the best thing you can do when someone is very upset is call for a break. Go into another room with them if you're the attorney. Have them just do some deep breathing and try to remind them that even though this is feeling bad in this moment, that either these children or these issues are going to continue for many years down the road, and they need to focus on that end. Also, just listening and letting them vent. My father used to always tell me when I made decisions, think about 5 years down the road, would you still be happy looking back at this decision?
Thank you. The last question is that since you deal with such sensitive cases, how would you as a mediator keep your emotions in check?
I suffer from a particularly debilitating form of optimism. So I guess I always feel like we can come out through this process with something better, stronger, and healthier. I do have my self-care because the secondary trauma is a real thing. And hearing such brutality day after day can take a toll on your soul. So I find that, especially on my drive home, when I wasn't working from home, that was 20 minutes where I'd put on music that I liked. I would sing and dance in my car. And by the time I got home, I had been able to leave work at work and be fully present with my family.
Thank you, Ms. Maureen Robertshaw, for such a vibrant, interactive, and knowledgeable session. I would also like to thank all the participants for joining us, and I would request everyone to please fill the feedback form provided in the chat box to receive your certificates. Please note that the certificates will be issued within 7 business days. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much for joining us. If you don't want to miss any updates from MediateGuru, follow us on our social media handles and also join the WhatsApp updates group sent in the chat box below. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much for having me, and please reach out.